On this episode of the Most Notorious podcast, the 1906 potato masher murder of Cecilia Ludwig.
When the fire department comes to the house, and again, we're going to talk about the other side of the story, but when the fire department comes to the house, the closet door is closed. There's a rocking chair in front of the closet door. Cecilia's charred body, nude, charred body, is inside the closet. The fire chief says she looked like a half-baked chicken. I mean, that's terrible. And how could you have a fire to that degree with so little oxygen in a 5x8 closet without some accelerant?
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Most Notorious podcast. I'm Eric Rivenis. Great to have you here. Just as a reminder, if you want to listen to the Most Notorious podcast ad-free, you can become a patron at patreon.com/mostnotorious. Okay, on with the show, and it's a great one. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Gary Sosniecki. He worked at newspapers in 4 states during his 43-year career, and he has won dozens of awards, including a Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society of Weekly Newspaper Editors. And he is here to talk about his new book called The Potato Masher Murder: Death at the Hands of a Jealous Husband. Great to have you here. Thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Eric.
Yes, of course. So you have a very personal connection to this story, don't you?
I do. The victim was my great-grandmother. And this was something that growing up I heard very little about. Just cryptically, when I did hear something about her. My brother and I have talked about this. We just didn't know very much about the murder, other than we knew that our great-grandmother was murdered. And it's something that I became more and more curious about as I grew older. And at a certain point, I decided, hey, it's time to look into this.
And you certainly did. You wrote an entire book about it. So having had 2 Norwegian grandmothers, I am very familiar with potato mashers. But for someone who may not be, can you explain what a potato masher is and what it looked like specifically in the early 20th century?
They were a wooden kitchen tool, and they came in many different shapes, but they were used, of course, to mash potatoes in the pot. But some of them were cylindrical. Some of them had a bell-shaped wooden carving at the end of them. I use one description in the book where it's like the knob end of a baseball bat cut off. And if a potato masher of that vintage wooden potato masher was swung like a mallet or a police baton, it could be a deadly weapon. And in the case of my great-grandmother's murder, it was used to commit a murder, but there's a lot of questions that we don't know who swung the potato masher first, but it definitely was used as part of her death.
So if you don't mind, let's start with Cecilia Henderson, your great-grandmother. Who was she, and how did she find herself married to Albin Ludwig?
Cecilia was born in Scotland along with her sisters, and her parents emigrated to the United States, left Scotland. Times were hard in Scotland, and arrived first in Chicago, and then found their way to LaPorte County, Indiana, a little town named Kingsbury, which is about a dozen miles south of LaPorte, Indiana. And just as an aside, LaPorte, Indiana is famous in a very major murder, the Belle Gunness murders, serial killer. And I know you've interviewed Harold Schechter about his book on the Belle Gunness murders. So they settled in Kingsbury and they farmed there. Cecilia married the first time. She was 15 years old and 7 months pregnant when she was married to my great grandfather, who would be Charlie Hornberg. And that's not a very good start to a marriage when you're 15 years old and 7 months pregnant. But so be it. They had a son who was my grandpa, William Hornberg, and 2 years later they had a daughter, Lyle. And 7 months after Lyle's birth, Cecilia filed for divorce. She left the house, filed for divorce, and charged cruel and inhumane treatment. Charlie Hornberg was accused of striking her with probably a steel rod, holding a gun to her head. There were various things, cruel and inhumane treatment that Cecilia had to endure, so she left. And there was a divorce, and the divorce was final, I think, in 1896, and Cecilia had custody of the little girl who was an infant, and my grandpa, William, and I think he was known as Willie as a kid, he went to live with his father. So Cecilia, she had 3 sisters, and she hung around with them. In one case, one census report, Cecilia was living at a home where her sister was a domestic. At some point, she found her way 2 counties over to Elkhart County, Indiana. And these counties that we're talking about in Indiana are in the northern tier of counties. They all border Michigan. So there's 3 counties that are important to this story: the LaPorte County, where the Hendersons are from, and St. Joseph County in the middle, where the murder occurred and where the trial was held, and then Elkhart County over on the east side. So she found herself to Elkhart County, and she was working as a domestic for a Reverend Townsend. Now, at some point, while working as a domestic, she met a man named Albin Ludwig. Albin Ludwig's family had come from Germany, and they had settled in Elkhart County about the same time that the Henderson family had settled in LaPorte County. And Albin Ludwig, he'd worked as a teamster for the city of Elkhart. About 1901, he opened a saloon called the Monument Saloon, and it was in the 100 block of South Main Street in Elkhart. So it was right downtown. It was called the Monument Saloon because of a Civil War monument that was just a few blocks away. I'm not sure how they met. It doesn't seem to me likely that Cecilia would have walked into a tavern about 1901, but Albin claimed to be a good church worker, so perhaps they met in church. So they fell in love and they got married, and initially they moved in with Albin's widowed mother, and that didn't last real long. Cecilia was accused of striking Albin's mother, and then about 10 days later of striking Albin's sister-in-law, the wife of Albin's brother Gustav. And they got thrown out of the house. So that's not a too good a start for a marriage. So they wound up I think they either bought or rented a home, and I think they bought another home in Elkhart. But Albin was trying to unload the saloon, and eventually he either sold or closed the saloon, and they moved to Mishawaka for a fresh start. Mishawaka, Indiana is, today you'd say it's a sister city to South Bend, and I think we all know where South Bend is because of Notre Dame. So Mishawaka is just east of South Bend, and the 2 towns have grown together now, and that sets the stage for the murder.
So Albin Ludwig, you write in your book that in his younger years, he was kind of a quiet guy. but after owning a saloon, it changed his disposition, made him a little meaner, angrier, right?
Yeah, I don't think he was cut out to be a businessman. And he he stayed pretty much on the right side of the law, but he did get accused once of selling to minors and so forth. He had to pay some fines, and he had someone working for him who he sent him to the bank to with some money, and I think the guy who spent the money at another bar and so forth. So I'm sure he was frustrated in business, and he tried to unload it to someone else. At some point he did, and the couple moved to Mishawaka. And interestingly, Gustav, the brother, never visited them just 12, 13 miles away in Mishawaka during the time that they were living there until after the murder.
And they made an interesting looking couple. He was around 5'7", which at the time was pretty average.
Yeah, and Cecilia was about 3 inches taller. She was a tall girl. All of the Henderson girls were tall, and their father was something like 6'7" himself. He was a big man, and the mother wasn't short, from what I've been able to find out from these distant cousins who I've discovered during this writing process. So they were big, and Cecilia was tall. And Cecilia also was a big girl, big boned. She weighed about 165 pounds. When you see her photo, and there is one existing photo of Cecilia that we turned up, she's an attractive woman for that period, but she's tall and big.
It's interesting. He claimed, whenever asked, that he was deeply in love with her, but there were numerous accounts of abuse throughout
Yes.
your book. This couple had a deeply volatile relationship, didn't they?
They did. They both had ferocious tempers. And I warn folks, there are no heroes in this book, because they were both flawed people, flawed characters. They both had tempers. Both of them used foul language. There's evidence that both of them threatened to kill the other one at various times. Cecilia had been heard at various times saying that she was going to poison him, or she was going to knock his block off at some point. And just a week and a half before the murder, Albin told his mother-in-law that if Cecilia ever left him, he would kill her. So, this wasn't a surprise to people, to neighbors, that this, what happened, actually happened.
So sometime in late August, early September, Cecilia's sister Jeanne and her two children moved into the house, which probably didn't do much to calm the situation.
Right. Her younger sister Jeanne moved in to the house during the summer and brought along two kids. And the kids were young. I think the little boy was 6, and I think the little girl was 9 or 10. And Jeanne was supposed to pay $10 a month rent to stay with them, which never happened. Now, Jeanne was similar to Cecilia. She left her husband in Nevada. He was a mining engineer and worked for various companies in California and Nevada, mining for gold. And she took off. She was a bit of a runaround too. And Cecilia had a reputation as a runaround. But Jeanne moved into the house, and Jeanne and Cecilia took off almost every day, shopping, gallivanting around town. Gadding about was one of the terms that came up. And Albin was upset. First, Albin said, "You're leaving all the time, but I'm not getting to go with you." And that upset him, that his wife would want to go out all the time, but he couldn't go with. It was just Cecilia and Jeanne. And then there was a man involved, a man by the name of Fred Young. Fred also came from Kingsbury. He was a widower, and they met Fred one day in Mishawaka. He had come to Mishawaka after his wife died, got work there. Well, Fred started hanging around at the house, coming over for dinner and just being a frequent visitor. And Albin thought that Fred had a thing for Cecilia. Albin was a terribly jealous sort, and he thought that there was something going on between Fred and Cecilia. I think, in truth, what was going on, it was going on between Fred and Jeanne, who Fred referred to as Mrs. Ellsworth, Jeanne Ellsworth. And I think there was something going on between the two of them, but it made Albin really jealous. And this came to a head on the evening of September 24th, 1906. Jeanne and Cecilia had been gone all afternoon shopping for shoes and came home and fixed dinner, and the three, well, they all had dinner, the kids and Albin, and they had dinner, and then Cecilia and Jeanne went out again, and this irritated Albin. They said they were going to the drugstore, but Albin was very suspicious, so he followed them. Well, yeah, they went to the drugstore and they refilled a bottle of iodine and glycerin, which is a poison. Supposedly, Cecilia used it to treat her sore feet, but it is a poison if ingested, which comes up later in the story. But then, instead of coming back home, they went to downtown Mishawaka. Now, that's across the St. Joseph River. It's about a 15-minute walk from the house. And Albin followed them. He wanted to see where they were going. So the women wound up at what was called the Four Corners of Mishawaka. It would be South Main Street, south of the river, so South Main Street and 2nd Street. And for people who are familiar with Mishawaka now, that's called Lincoln Way. So they're at the Four Corners. And Albin is standing in front of the Milburn House, which is a tavern and hotel. So Albin was standing there, and he watched the women. He saw the women peek into a saloon through a window, saloon on the northeast corner of the intersection. And then they walked across the street in front of a drugstore, the A.P. Graham Southside Drugstore. And there they ran into a man. It was not Fred Young. It was a man by the name of Ackerman. His first name was lost to history. So they were talking to this man. So Albin, as jealous as he was, he walked up to the corner to see better. And there was a policeman at the corner by the name of James Anderson. He was a patrolman for Mishawaka Police Department. And Albin asked the patrolman, he said, "Do you know who those women are?" And this is dusk now, so the patrolman couldn't see. So he walked in the middle of the intersection, or maybe 3/4 of the way across the intersection. And he came back and said, "Well, that's your wife and her sister. I see them around town all the time," which I'm sure that Albin in his mind was thinking, "Yeah, I bet you do." So Albin said something to the effect that, "I wanted you to see them just in case something happens," which was kind of a prediction that something was going to happen. Well, the women left the corner, and with Ackerman, who Albin referred to as the bridge man because the guy worked on the Mishawaka Bridge, they walked up a block or so to a boarding house, and that boarding house is where Fred Young lived. And Ackerman went in and got Fred Young out, and then Ackerman took off. So you've got Fred Young and the two women, and they start walking back to East Marion Street to the Ludwig home, and again, that's a 15-minute walk. So you've got two married women, both who are having marital problems, and this young guy, a widower, the three of them walking back to the house. They get back to the house, and the quarrels start, because Albin is back to the house by this time. They have an argument outside. They have an argument inside. And Albin does not seem to be as mad at Fred during this evening as he is at Cecilia. The arguments stop. They start. Albin goes and talks to neighbors, and he kind of blows off some steam talking to neighbors. But this goes on till 11 o'clock at night, and there's sort of a decision that Jeanne and Cecilia are both going to leave the next day. Cecilia is going to leave the marriage, at least temporarily, and Jeanne is going to leave what I'm sure is to her is a pretty toxic place to be hanging out. And that all sets the scene for what happens on the next day.
During the time when Albin is spying on Cecilia from across the street, she gets hit by a brick suddenly, doesn't she?
Yeah, and it's interesting. She suspects that Albin has thrown the brick, and somehow there's a dog that barks at the same time or close to the time that she's hit by the brick, and she says, "Oh, that sounds like our dog," and this dog, I can't believe that this dog would have followed Albin 15 minutes across the river and everything, but there's no other indication that the dog was involved. But she is hit by this brick. It comes from between two buildings, and Albin denies that he threw the brick. It hits her on the hip. It hurts her a little bit, but not enough that she can't walk home, and it doesn't really come up again. The subject, but somebody threw a brick, and I guess if it wasn't an accident from somewhere else, it had to have been Albin who threw the brick.
Which wouldn't have likely surprised her because she had been beaten by Albin before, right?
She had been, yes. There was one incident where even when they were in Elkhart, where I think he was accused of having her on the floor, choking her. And there's no excuse for beating a spouse, but you have to realize that Cecilia was flirtatious and probably promiscuous. It was not a good marriage. I think you saw in the book that Albin came home from work one morning, and he cites that exact date every time this comes up. He knows the exact date. It was in 1903 when he comes home from work early one morning because he forgot his well, today we'd say his watch. He probably a pocket watch that he forgot. And he goes into the house and he can't find Cecilia. Her clothes are on the bed, but he eventually finds Cecilia in a bedroom on the opposite corner of the house. And she's hiding in a closet with a boarder. They had a boarder in the house by the name of Smoke Minen, and the two of them are hiding in a closet. Now, the fact that her clothes were on the bed leads to me to some suspicion that perhaps they were not dressed in that closet. That never comes up, but it's kind of implied. So that's one incident. Then there's another incident where Albin comes home from work one day about 4:30 in the afternoon and opens the door, and they're sitting on the sofa. Cecilia is sitting on the sofa, and there's a traveling salesman who's sitting on her lap. And you think of that, well, that seems odd, but on the other hand, Cecilia is a big girl, and a small man could be sitting on her lap. So Cecilia has had a habit of taking off and going to South Bend and staying at South Bend for a week or two at a time. So obviously, Albin may have been in love with Cecilia, but there's a question about how much in love with Albin Cecilia was.
With a horrific history of abuse from both her husbands, how do you feel about that, being her great-grandson?
I guess I knew this, but it surprised me when I started doing some research and realized that wife beating was legal in many parts of the country until about the 1870s. And even after that, folks kind of looked the other way when a wife was beaten. And that's just a terrible thing. But it happened. And I think one of the lessons, I think, in the book is, there was domestic violence back then, and this is a case of extreme domestic violence, but there probably was nowhere for Cecilia to turn, even if she had wanted to do something about it. There was no place for her to turn where there is today. There are agencies that you can go to. In the town where I live, a town of 14,000, there's a very active agency where spouses can go when there's a problem. Cecilia probably didn't have that option.
And the fact that Jeanne was living with her and witnessing this toxic relationship, Jeanne was really her way out, wasn't she?
Well, Jeanne was her way out. Jeanne gave her someone that she could hang around with every day, and of course they grew up together, and I'm sure they hung out together. Jeanne was a little bit younger, and they hung out together as kids. So yeah, when Jeanne decided to leave, and Cecilia was going to leave too, and that created some of the quarreling on the day of the murder.
Yeah, the day of the murder, a lot of strange things happened before the murder.
Yeah,
He's working at this point at a shoe factory,
that's right.
and suddenly, suspiciously, he decides not to go to work that day.
Yeah, and he slept till 9 o'clock too, which surprises me. If things were as tense as they were the night before, and if they were still quarreling at 11 o'clock the night before, and a neighbor still heard the women talking to each other at midnight the night before, and Albin is able to sleep till 9 o'clock in the morning. I don't know. He's had a stronger constitution than I have. I would have been up half the night after a night like that. So he sleeps to 9 o'clock in the morning, and he's somewhat miffed that Cecilia didn't make breakfast for him, although it comes out later that Cecilia hadn't made breakfast for him for the past year. So Albin goes downstairs and reads the newspaper, and there is some quarreling, but it's not real strong at that point. Cecilia says, "Well, I would leave if I had a trunk to pack in," and Albin says, "Well, I'll give you a trunk." So Albin gets a trunk for her, but over the course of the morning, Albin says, "I really don't want you to leave. If you just want to go to South Bend like you normally do for a week or so, that's fine. But if you're leaving, I would welcome you back," which of course I find kind of strange, but I would welcome you back. But if you're leaving permanently, I'm going to let the house go. He was making mortgage payments on this house, and this was a brand new neighborhood that they moved into. So he was making mortgage payments on the house, and I don't think they owned all the furniture. I think they were making payments on the furniture too. So he was just going to let all that go. And that then created friction in what Cecilia wanted if she left, if they divorced. Cecilia wanted everything. And Albin said, and by everything I mean all of the property. And Albin was only offering half. He said, "No, you get half if you leave." So they had arguments about the division of property during the morning. Well, at a certain point in the morning, Cecilia and Jeanne decide, well, they need to cook some. They're leaving. They're packing. They need to prepare dinner, which is a noon meal. And Jeanne says, "Well, I need to go find a livery to pick up our trunks." So she leaves just before they eat. And meanwhile, Cecilia sends Albin on an errand. They're using a gasoline cook stove. And gasoline cook stoves were very common in that era. And that just fascinates me. That gasoline was used in cook stoves. As we think of gasoline now, how dangerous that would be to be lighting it. But she sends Albin to get some gasoline, and he goes to the grocery store to buy 2 gallons of gasoline. He stops and buys a bottle of brandy or whiskey. It wasn't real sure what. No one could decide what it was. It was brandy or whiskey, but he buys a bottle of that too. He comes back, and Cecilia cooks dinner. They're having a dinner of boiled meat and potatoes. Boiled meat was a common meal back then. So they sit down at the dinner table, and it would be Albin and Cecilia and Jeanne's two children. And this is the point where the story, there's two versions of this story. One version is the prosecution story, and one is the defense story.
So, according to Albin, he is served a cup of coffee by Cecilia, and he immediately notices a strange taste.
It's bitter, yeah, and he doesn't eat very much of the meal, but the coffee tastes bitter. And she brings the cup of coffee. She doesn't bring a coffee pot, but just the cup for him. So they have finished the meal. Now this is Albin's story now, and so the stories start to diverge at this point. So Albin feels sick to his stomach. He goes and sits on the front step of the porch for a few minutes, and there are witnesses. There's some tradesmen who are working on a new home around the corner, and people see him sitting there, and he looks kind of despondent, but he doesn't feel good. His stomach is upset. So I mean, it's possible that he was poisoned. On the other hand, he has enormous stress going on, and it's also possible he's just sick to his stomach from stress. But he's sick to his stomach. While he's sitting on the porch, the kids, Jeanne's kids, want to go get some candy, and Cecilia hollers, well, "Don't be stingy, give them a nickel or whatever, so to penny to go get candy." So that gets the kids out of the house. So Albin then gets up and he goes into the backyard to fetch a slop jar, or which also went by the name of chamber pot. And so he fetches this because he's sick to his stomach, and he feels like he's going to defecate and throw up. And he takes this upstairs and puts this in the closet right off the bedroom, and he lays down on the bed. Now that is one version of the story up to a certain point.
And then, as he is wondering what's happening, he suddenly starts thinking about his life insurance policy. And he's wondering in his head whether Cecilia has poisoned him. And then suddenly he makes it his mission to find that policy with the intent to quickly change the beneficiary before he dies.
Right, because he was going to leave the money to his mother. So he looks in the dresser, and the policy isn't there. So then he decides, well, I'm going to look in this trunk. So he goes into this walk-in closet where the trunk is. And this closet is about 5 feet by 7 feet. It's a pretty good sized closet. So this closet is off the bedroom. And he goes in there, and there's no window in there, and again, there's no electricity in the closet. So he carries a kerosene lamp with him, and he starts going through the trunk. Now, again, this is Albin's side of the story, and we'll get into the other side of the story here in a few minutes, I'm sure. But Albin's going through the trunk looking for the insurance policy. Well, Cecilia comes upstairs, and Cecilia is carrying a potato masher. Again, we're talking about a wooden potato masher, a mallet, something that's got some substance. So she's carrying it, and she says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I'm looking for the insurance policy." And she says, "You son of a bitch." And she follows up and says, "Have you decided about the property? Well, you get half." And she says, "I want it all." And he says, "Well, only a court will give you all." And she says, "You goddamn son of a bitch." And she takes the potato masher and swings at him. Again, this is Albin's side of the story. She swings at him with the potato masher. Albin grabs the potato masher, wards off the blow. The potato masher drops to the floor, and he grabs Cecilia by the neck. And he pushes Cecilia against the closet wall. Well, there are wire hooks in the wall where you would hang clothes. And I remember from going to my grandparents' house as a kid, there would be these wire hooks, and you don't see them too often now. So he jams her head against this wire hook. Now, according to Albin's lawyers, that's what caused the wound in Cecilia's head. Not a potato masher, but the wire hook. But he does choke her, and she collapses. Of course, he later on he says, well, she had a weak heart, which is a whole different story, but she collapses. Now, Albin tells this story over and over again, and it never changes. But he doesn't remember anything from this point. At least he says he doesn't remember anything at this point. She falls to the floor, but somehow she catches on fire. His lawyers will say, okay, the kerosene lantern fell, and that's what set her on fire. But when the fire department comes to the house, and again, we're going to talk about the other side of the story, but when the fire department comes to the house, the closet door is closed. There's a rocking chair in front of the closet door. Cecilia's nude charred body is inside the closet. The fire chief says she looked like a half-baked chicken. I mean, that's terrible. And how could you have a fire to that degree with so little oxygen in a 5x8 closet without some accelerant? And then we get to the prosecution side of the story.
Right. So Jeanne's boy, his name is Charles, right?
Yes.
Yeah. He's sent out to get some candy, and he's due back at the house at some point. His role in this becomes very important, right, at a certain point in the story.
Well, yeah, and both kids supposedly were sent out for the candy, but according to the next door neighbor sees smoke coming out of the west window upstairs, which would be the bedroom's west window. And she goes to the back door, and the little boy is in the house. And the little boy is aware there's been a terrible quarrel, but he isn't aware of, or at least he doesn't say what actually is going on, other than there's been a fight. And different newspapers reported different things from the little boy, but he is the only possible witness. And of course, he's only 5 or 6 years old. I'm not sure if he had turned 6 yet, or if it was 6 who hadn't turned 7 yet. But he is in the house while all this is going on.
So neighbors see smoke.
Fire department is called.
The fire department is called. They enter the house, and they see something extremely gruesome upon their arrival, right?
They do. They fire department comes, and plus you already have neighbors who have come in, and I'll refer to them as rescuers. And the front door is locked, so there's construction work going on around the corner. So they grab a ladder from this construction site, and they put it on top of they put it against the porch. The porch has a roof, and they climb up on that roof, and they go through the windows. And they get through the windows, and they find Albin Ludwig laying in a pool of blood next to the bed. There's blood on the bed. There's blood on the floor. Albin is cut on the throat. He's cut on his arms. He's cut on his legs. One of the cuts on his legs is 3 inches deep. And he is unconscious. At least everyone thinks he's unconscious. There's some question about whether he was really unconscious. So that's the very first thing they see. There's smoke, but they see this guy who is all bloodied up on the floor. So they come in, and they've got to fight the fire too. And they look around, and they discover that the fire actually is coming from this closet. So they move this chair and some other obstacles from in front of the closet, and open the closet door, and start aiming a hose at the ceiling because it's licking the ceiling is actually coming out the sides of the closet door and licking at a dresser. And after it's at that point where they're starting to fight the fire in the closet that they see on the floor, there is this body, and it's of a woman, and her clothes are burned off. So you've got the second gruesome sight, and if the first sight wasn't gruesome enough, then you've got this sight of this woman. The jewelry is partially melted. The only clothing that is still on her, there's some metal stays from her corset, and that's it. So you've got a pretty gruesome scene here, as well as you've got every Tom, Dick, and Harry in the neighborhood is running through this scene too. So it's certainly not a secure scene, and that to me that leads some questions as part of the investigation later on.
Yeah, for sure. So local newspapers jump on this story immediately, and their assumption right off the bat is that Albin murdered his wife and then he tried to kill himself, right?
Right. And I want to speak about the newspapers first, since I spent 43 years in the newspaper business. Every town, every city there had two newspapers. Mishawaka had a smaller town, had two weekly newspapers, but South Bend had two daily newspapers. Elkhart had two daily newspapers. LaPorte had two daily newspapers. And every one of them jumped on this story because they all had a tie to this story. LaPorte because, Kingsbury girl victim of vicious, horrible murder, and Elkhart man accused of this murder. And I was fascinated, Eric, by the fact that these afternoon newspapers, this happened between 1:30 and 2:30 in the afternoon, and it still made the afternoon newspapers. And that just, being a newspaper guy, that just fascinated me that it was on the front page of both of the South Bend newspapers that afternoon.
Yeah, definitely. So Albin Ludwig is taken to the hospital.
Right.
And while they still continue to investigate the scene of the crime, the assumption is that there probably won't be a need for a trial because Ludwig is likely to die.
Yeah. One day he's getting worse. They think he's going to have gangrene. But the newspapers, a competitive situation too at newspapers, you get different stories. One newspaper would say he may not live through the day or through the night, and the other newspaper says he's getting better. But he was sick for a long time. Now, most of these wounds, the razor wounds, were superficial, but he did have a 3-inch, he had a wound to his calf that went 3 inches deep, and it didn't hit the bone, but it came close to the bone. And that's a pretty serious wound. Plus, we talked about the iodine and glycerin. We talked about the coffee, which may or may not have been poisoned. But it's pretty evident that Albin drank poison at some point. Whether it was in the coffee or whether he went to Cecilia's dresser and got that bottle of iodine and glycerin and drank that as part of a suicide attempt, because Albin had some pretty serious throat injuries too. And he vomited a few times afterwards, after the rescuers came. So you got all kinds of possibilities here.
Yeah. One of the facts that I found quite remarkable is that Albin's brother Gustav was allowed into the house, and a lot of people were allowed in the house, which was pretty crazy.
Even the reporters were in the house, and I'm thinking the only time I ever got into a burning house was in a small town. They needed help getting the furniture out, and so that's something. There was no yellow tape, but Gustav is in the house. He's in the house with the police chief, with his wife, with the police chief's wife, with some relative of the police chief. They're in the house just a few days later. And then after that, Gustav is the brother is the one who sweeps out the debris from the closet. Well, can you imagine that today? The brother of the suspected murderer cleaning out the closet within a couple weeks of the murder, and he finds broken glass from the kerosene lantern, or at least that's what he claims it is, broken glass for the kerosene lantern, which is introduced in the trial as evidence that Albin's story is the correct story. So that just fascinates too. And of course Gustav wound up in prison at the same time as Albin, which is something we talk about in the appendix of the book.
Right. So everyone thinks Albin is going to die, but he recovers. And Albin realizes that he doesn't want to die anymore. He wants to live. So everything changes, and prosecutors are now set on nailing him for the murder of his wife.
Right. Yeah, and Albin didn't even have a lawyer until a few weeks before the trial. You know, he was not on the best of terms with Gustav, and there'd been some feuding over their father's estate, and Gustav hadn't visited the family after it moved to Mishawaka, so the family didn't come up with any money for hiring a defense attorney until the very last minute. And then part of the deal was that Gustav and some other lawyer would be the ones to wind up to find the witnesses. The lawyer they hired was Samuel Parker, who was I'm sure he was a pretty expensive lawyer. He was a well-known, very good lawyer, former state senator. They hired Samuel Parker, but they were trying to save a buck. So he's going to have to stand trial. And of course, then the prosecution is coming up with its theory of the case. And the prosecution's theory of the case is that there was a fight at the dinner table. There was a quarrel that escalated, and that Albin grabbed the potato masher, and that he chased Cecilia upstairs. And at some point during this quarrel upstairs, he smacked her on the head with a potato masher, creating this wound, a wound that was deep enough that one of the doctors doing the autopsy could stick a finger into it. So he hit her, knocked her unconscious, dragged her into the closet, and then, and I'm personally not sure exactly when he cut himself, but he must have cut himself at least partly, had done some of the self-inflicted wounds, because there is blood downstairs. According to the prosecution, he goes downstairs with a tin can, he fills it up full of gasoline or kerosene, brings it back upstairs, pours it on the body, the accelerant, and sets it on fire. And then the closet door would have to be closed. And, it's a pretty enormous fire if it's going to do that much damage to a body. So that is the prosecution theory. And then, of course, Albin finishes cutting himself up or whatever and is feigning unconsciousness. And, either he drank the poison or Cecilia poisoned him in the coffee cup. We don't know, because there was no technology. Then forensics didn't know how to test for poison.
So the trial begins. He's charged with murder.
First degree.
Degree murder, right. And the prosecutor is a guy named Talbot. And he's just starting his career, but he's a very ambitious and able young man.
Yeah, the Indianapolis Star had just run a feature on him. He was just elected prosecuting attorney, and he was very young, early 30s. And immediately after Talbot took office, he started cleaning up the gambling machines in South Bend and St. Joseph County, the gambling machines, and drinking on Sundays. That was against the law, and he started cleaning up that. So there was it was short, but it was a profile of him in the Indianapolis Star talking about what a great job he was doing. So this was in January, and by April, late April, is when the trial occurred. So he was a top-notch young attorney, and the already mentioned Samuel Parker, defense attorney. So, these were two high-profile lawyers handling this case.
The Henderson family, Cecilia's family, was not actually at the trial, with the exception of Cecilia's mother, who showed up on the last day of the trial. And Jeanne, her sister, would have made an exceptional prosecution witness.
Yeah, she's gone. And the supposition, one of the things I discovered, one of the really cool things I discovered in doing this, I discovered a lot of cousins who I didn't know existed. And thankfully, due to the internet and these genealogy websites, I was able to discover that. And I discovered Jeanne's grandson. And he's in his 70s. He lives in California. And I interviewed him, and he believes that Jeanne left, that perhaps she went to Kingsbury immediately, but she headed out back to Nevada because her husband found gold. And she didn't stay very long. She left again, but she was gone. And what a witness she would have made. Now, she would have been a prosecution witness because she wouldn't have helped the defense at all, but she could have related all of these things that were happening that were leading up to the murder, up to the point when she left to get delivery.
There are a lot of witnesses. Obviously, we don't have time to go through all of them and their testimony. But the star witness, I guess you might say, was Albin Ludwig himself. It's unusual, right, when a defense attorney allows their client to testify. But in this trial, Ludwig took the stand to defend himself. So how did his testimony go?
He's on the stand for hours. He started testifying in the morning. He was still testifying in the afternoon. And I think I wrote, and Eric, and you can check this. I think it was 86 pages in the transcript are devoted to Albin's testimony, and his story never changed. He told the story the way I want to say believed it to be true, but the way he wanted it to be told, he told the story that way, which is that he admitted choking her. Of course, she had a weak heart, he said, but he admitted choking her. And he didn't remember anything afterwards. And one of the things that I found really interesting, I have a copy of a 6.5-page description of the crime that Albin wrote on his first week in prison, and that was in the Indiana State Archives along with the trial transcript. And his story, it never changed. It was always the same. So either it happened that way, or he convinced himself that it happened that way, or he was a very good liar who was able to hold to that story.
Was Talbot's cross-examination successful? When all was said and done, did the jury find him convincing at all?
Well, Talbot was very good in questioning him. Talbot tripped him up a few times, but one of the newspapers wrote out after Albin's testimony that it was believable. Now, whether it was true or not, but it could be believable. People who attended the trial who thought that he might get away with manslaughter, which would be a lesser offense. Of course, he was charged with first-degree murder. But the judge, the testimony wraps up on a Thursday night, and the closing statements are on a Friday, and they wrap up the closing statements about 5 o'clock. And the newspapers were speculating about the case going to go to the jury on Saturday morning. And obviously Judge Funk, Walter Funk, who was the circuit judge, my feeling is Judge Funk was not impressed enough with Albin's defense. He sent the jury out at 5:30 that Friday night. The jury went out to decide the case, and it took them 5 hours to decide the case. And the decision was second-degree murder, which was he intended to kill her, but it wasn't premeditated, and that's probably fair. He was sentenced to life in prison.
So he escaped execution, and he would eventually be incarcerated in the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, correct?
Yeah. I did a little research into white murders, in Indiana during that decade. And I say wife murders with quotation marks around that, because that is a term that newspapers used. Oh, there was a wife murder in Mishawaka, or a wife murder in Fort Wayne. And I'm thinking, wow, what a strange term that was used regularly. So I did a little research into them. I found about a dozen or so wife murders, and it seemed like first degree murder, they either hung you or you wound up serving about 16 years. Even if you had a life sentence, you wound up serving only 15 or 16 years. And apparently that was pretty common in those days.
Of course, they tried to appeal the verdict, right? And that was turned down.
From an author's point of view, thank God that they appealed the case, because the trial transcript does not exist in St. Joseph County. We went to the St. Joseph County archives, which is in the Warehouse District of South Bend, and we were told that felony cases were disposed of, the records were disposed of after 55 years. And that really disappointed me. I didn't know whether I had a book or a magazine article or just curiosity of family history. I didn't know what I had. But when the case was appealed, and I had bought through the internet mugshots from the Indiana State Archives. I have a mugshot of Albin, and I have a mugshot of Gustav. And I was corresponding with an archivist at the Indiana State Archives who handled the sale of the mugshots. And I said, this case was appealed to the Indiana Supreme Court. And if you're ever in the Supreme Court archives and happen to find the trial transcript, I'd sure like to know. And this archivist named Michael Vettman, he called me. It couldn't have been a week or more than 2 weeks, probably only a week later, and said, Mr. Sosniecki, I've got it. And if that case hadn't been appealed, I would not have had a transcript, and without the transcript, I would not have had this book.
So the appeal failed, but he was a pretty well-behaved prisoner, and eventually he was given parole.
Yes, he was after 16 years, and interestingly enough, it was an Elkhart policeman who, at one point, the policeman had. I think the policeman was involved in rescuing his wife when he was choking her at a dance back when they lived in Elkhart. But it was a policeman who sponsored Albin's parole and put him to work. And as best as I can tell from city directories, Albin went to work in the restaurant business. He may have even had his own restaurant in Elkhart through the years. And he lived a fairly long life. He outlived his wife considerably. He did not marry again, although one relative thought that he was married, but I can find no evidence that he married again. He died in 1954, is buried in an unmarked grave in a different cemetery from the rest of the Ludwigs, and there was no obituary in the Elkhart Truth newspaper. We looked both online, and we went to the library in Elkhart and searched through the microfilm, and we could find no obituary. The only place where his death is noted is in a book that the funeral home that handled the body had a list of deaths that it handled, and that was one of the deaths. That's the only way we knew about it.
One of the jobs he had after he got out was as a door-to-door tea and coffee salesman, which is pretty scary.
Yeah, that's what one of the relatives said. One of my new relatives said that, and I think she said that her mother was scared to death when he came to the neighborhood, as she should be, especially if you killed an aunt or something. And I think that's what the relationship was.
So what do you believe really happened? Do you think the prosecution's theory was well constructed?
I think Albin Ludwig killed my great-grandmother. But I think there are a lot of questions that are unresolved. We don't know, for example, if the blood that was on the banister, on the door casings, we don't know whether Albin left that blood there when he was going downstairs to fetch gasoline, or whether that was from rescuers. They're handling this bloody body they could have had blood on their hands. So we don't know where that blood came from. We assume it came from Albin, but of course there was no blood typing then. There was no DNA testing, so we think that was Albin's blood. It's very unlikely it was Cecilia's blood, but we think that was Albin's blood. But we don't know that. We don't know if there was poison in that coffee cup and the residue of the cup. Today that cup would have been tested to see whether there had been poison in it, if the iodine and glycerin or if some other poison had been in the cup. So we don't know that. That would answer a lot about it. Of course, we don't know where Jeanne was for sure. We suspect that she most likely was in Nevada because her husband had discovered gold again, but we don't know that for sure. I'm confident that Albin killed her, but we just don't know for sure all the details, how it happened. Other than that, a potato masher was involved at some point.
Right. Well, so your book has just recently been released.
Yes. August 11th was the official release date, although it's been available since mid-July.
And of course, it's available online and in bookstores as well.
Yes, it can be ordered directly from the publishers, Kent State University Press. It can be found on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million. All of the bookstores can order the book if they're not carrying it.
Well, this has been just great. Thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you very much for talking to me, Eric.
Again, I have been speaking to Gary Sosniecki. He is the author of The Potato Masher Murder, Death at the Hands of a Jealous Husband. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenis, and have a safe tomorrow.